Last week, if you were here, you know that we started what for us will be the last series of this year's Jesus season before Easter and Good Friday. The series called The Storyteller, which is based on these things called parables, sort of stories with spiritual points that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Luke, which is the gospel that we as a church are reading through together. Now, last Sunday, I was at the branch church in Alger Heights over on 28th Street doing this same message that I will do for you today. So hopefully you get the better version because this will be my second time doing it. And Chris DeBlay, their pastor, is over there doing the message you heard last week. This is how we get to the story that we're going to focus on today. In Luke chapter 11, as is Jesus' custom, he goes out by himself alone. He gets quiet and still, and he prays. And if you read through the Gospels in your New Testament about Jesus, you will find that this is something he does a lot. This is part of his usual spiritual routine, his spiritual rhythm. This was his habit. It is when he comes back that one of his followers, called a disciple, said to him, "Lord, will you please teach us to pray the way that we have seen you pray, the way that we know you pray in your life daily, weekly, as part of your routine?" Now, that may not strike you as all that interesting, but it ought to, and here's why. That disciple asking Jesus for Jesus to teach him how to pray was somebody who already did. In fact, all of Jesus' followers were people who already prayed a lot. As observant Jews in Jesus' day, they would have had the habit of praying daily and weekly prescripted prayers. We know what they were praying every day and every week as observant Jews. And yet still something about how Jesus prayed, his manner of praying, what he was praying about, how he went about it, it made these people who were already devout prayers themselves say, "I want what he's got. Teach me, somebody who already prays, about prayer, Jesus." Now, interestingly, here's what I know about you. Here's what I know about you in the room today. You already pray too. Several recent studies, one by BeliefNet, another by the Pew Research Institute, found that the typical American, 66% of us, 2/3 of all American people pray more than once a day. So that means 2/3 of the room today, maybe more. You guys are exceptional students, I'm sure. Maybe more of you pray more than once a day. Maybe even more intriguingly, more people pray than believe in God in America, which makes you wonder, who are the people praying to that don't believe in God? So what unites Americans more than their belief in an almighty being is their belief in prayer. Interesting. Over 40% of all American people say that their prayers are answered affirmatively often, meaning God says yes to whatever it is that they ask. Wow. For starters, I'd like you praying for me because I don't know that my success rate is that high in what I pray for. But 40% of the room here today thinks that God responds favorably when they pray and ask him for things. We even know what you tend to pray about. Without question, over and above every other thing in your life, what the typical American prays for are the needs of their family and their close friends. In fact, do you know that as an American person, you are 20 times more likely to pray for your own need or the needs of family or close friends than the needs of anybody else? in your life. So my point to you is simply this. You're not that unlike the disciples in Luke chapter 11. You are people who already pray. And yet, I wonder what you and I have to learn about prayer from Jesus, who was a devout prayer himself. I wonder if we shouldn't say to him what those disciples did back then, which is, okay, I already pray, but what do you, Jesus, have to teach me about prayer that I don't know on my own, that is outside of my usual experience or practice of prayer? Jesus responds to the request two ways. He teaches them what we have come to call the Lord's Prayer. You remember that from earlier in the service. And then he tells a story. And this is the story that Jesus tells to teach these people about prayer who were already praying a lot. Beginning in verse 5 of Luke chapter 11. Jesus tells this yarn. Suppose one of you has a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, "Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him." And your friend answers from within his house, "Don't bother me, the door's already locked, and my children are with me in bed. I can't get up and give you anything." Okay, some notes about this first part of the story. People were not, it was not more common in Jesus' day for people to arrive at your house at midnight than it is in your day. Apparently this guy's connecting flight from Damascus to Jerusalem was delayed, and his friend shows up at midnight, and there is no food in the house. And he wants to be a good host, just like you and I would want to be a good host. And he wants to offer his friend, who has traveled to see him, refreshment. Doesn't have anything. So he goes to his next door neighbor. And it's midnight. Let me explain the typical Jewish Middle Eastern home of Jesus' day. It's one room, or maybe 2, the second being your kitchen. But in most cases, it's one. It is one large room that's less than 500 square feet, so smaller than my first apartment that Heather and I had in marriage student housing at Dallas Theological Seminary. And everybody sleeps in the same bed. I have visions here of one of my wife's practices with my 2 kids where if they're all real tired and it's getting toward bedtime, they all pile up in our queen-size bed together and watch Mom's Kindle. And I can imagine that that's what you have here, the scene of the entire family on one mattress sleeping together. By the way, I'm like the world's lightest sleeper, and if I had to sleep in one bed with my 2 kids who sleep like octopi on Red Bull, I would never sleep again. So you can appreciate the image in the story. Neighbor A has a friend who's shown up and doesn't have anything to feed him, and he wants to be a good host. Neighbor B, like the rest of the village, is already asleep. And the door is locked, and the kids are asleep next to him or her in bed. So you can see the visual. Maybe there's there's a small window cut into the stucco side of the house. And you can hear friend A whispering into the window, "Hey, will you open your door for me? I need bread. I've got nothing at home for my friend." Jesus continues the story by saying, "I tell you this, even though that friend won't get up and give you anything out of friendship, he would meet your needs because of," this is the only time this word is used in the entire New Testament, "because of his audacity." It's a word that blends 2 things, boldness and shamelessness. So the friend, because they're neighbors and live next to each other, that's not going to be the reason the person gives bread so you can be a good host. It's out of your audacity to come whisper in his window that he open up his home at midnight after everybody in his home is asleep. And then Jesus begins to get to the point of his story, this point that he is trying to pass on to people who already pray a lot. Jesus says, "So I say to you, ask and it will be given. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and everyone who knocks finds an open door." Now here's the key to understanding what Jesus is driving at in this particular parable about an annoying neighbor that bangs on your door at midnight. It is the answer to that question. What does that story teach somebody who already has the habit of praying, like you do, and like his disciples do? What new insight or illumination do you gain about prayer and your prayer relationship with God that you would not otherwise have if Jesus didn't pass on this story in Luke 11? Well, obviously, the first main thrust of the story is this. Your prayer life with God, your prayer life to God, needs to look like the friend in the story. It needs to be bold, it needs to be shameless, and it needs to be audacious. You need to be very willing. You need to feel no compunction or guilt at all about banging on God's door at midnight. And somehow, some way, normal human beings who pray don't get that. And I guess part of me understands that. We don't want to go to God too often and run foul of his good graces. We don't want to be the kid that bothers him, right? We want to come to him an appropriate amount of times. We don't want to ruin our relationship with him by asking him too much or too often. I get that. But I think you can go a little further. I think that you have to tie this story together with the Lord's Prayer that preceded it. Really what Jesus is saying is, you take that Lord's Prayer that I taught you, and the different things in it, those different points of emphasis in it, and I want you to pray about those things like this neighbor who banged on his friend's door at midnight. So let me put up the points of emphasis in the Lord's Prayer and reiterate that we need to be audacious and courageous and shameless about praying for those things. And it's at this point I realize my normal prayer habit, my normal prayer routine is very courageous and very bold about one of those things, not all of them. And I suspect yours is the same way. Which one is it? It's my daily bread. It's my daily needs. It's the things that I know I need in my life, or I know someone I care about does. Who in the room hasn't had the experience of waking up at 2 a.m, scared or petrified about a need in your life that you can't see how it's going to be met? Your spouse has been diagnosed with an illness. It's mysterious. The doctors haven't figured it out yet, and it seems to be taking a terrible toll on him or her. You know what it's like to wake up at night in a cold sweat and pray to God audaciously and courageously about that need. Your daily bread. Some of you in the room know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night and be worried about the future of your family. You don't know where the next paycheck's going to come from. You don't know how you're going to pay your mortgage. And you know what it's like to wake up and to beg God, to bang on his door about your daily bread. I think we all get that. But what about the rest of it? When was the last time I or you banged on God's door at midnight about any of that other stuff. When was the last time I banged on God's door at midnight because I really needed to be forgiveness for something that I fouled up? Or that I really needed to be willing to forgive somebody else in the same way that I wanted to be forgiven? When was the last time I begged him on bended knee about that? When was the last time I banged on his door at midnight because I felt like the temptations in my life coming from without or from within were so strong that I couldn't resist them on my own? And so I banged on his door and I said, I need you. I need you right here in this part of my life. When was the last time you did that? When was the last time I banged on his door and said, I don't care what it is, I don't want to do in this situation or in this chapter of my life my will, what I think is right or what I think is best. I want to do your will. So I pray your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And I bang on his heavy wooden front door until he opens the door and listens and responds. You see the point, right? Jesus tells a story about this shameless, audacious neighbor who comes and asks for bread because he wants to be a good host. And Jesus says that ought to be the way that you and I behave about every one of those things up on the screen that he taught us in the Lord's Prayer. Not just one of them, which is what comes natural to us. Now, of course, the other thing that's very obvious from that story and the way Jesus ended it is that he wants us to be the ones to take initiative. Remember how it ends? Jesus tells the story and then he launches into the point himself. He says, ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. There is something in that instruction that is also beyond or past what you and I usually think about prayer. We, like the disciples, are already people who pray a lot. Well, what is it about that little nugget, that little insight, that we need to hear that we may not come up with on our own? Why is asking and seeking and knocking in prayer so important? Well, here's part of it. When you take the initiative to ask God about anything, you're making it real. Let me explain it this way. I'm sure you've had the experience in your life where you know you've needed to have a conversation with somebody that wasn't necessarily going to be an easy conversation. Maybe something had gone afoul in your friendship or your relationship with them. Maybe they had done something that had hurt you or offended you, or you know you did. And you know in your head, I need to do this. And you keep avoiding it or procrastinating. You postpone it. Why do you do that? Because the more you do it, it's not real. The minute you tap out the email to the person or you text them and you say, hey, can we get together? I'd like to talk to you about maybe what's gone wrong or gone off the track between the two of us. Can we do that? You make it real and you can't hide from it anymore. There's a part of your life that you want to improve, and you know that everything's going great other places, but there's this one place that I have been avoiding for a long time. And so you keep pushing it to the back of the table. You keep pushing it to the back of your brain. And the reason you don't take the first step to do anything about it is because the minute you take the first step, it makes it real. And you can no longer hide it. This is what prayer does. Jesus says we need to be the ones who take the initiative to ask. We need to be the ones who take the initiative to seek or to knock on the door. And part of why that's true is because it makes it real. And that, by the way, is also true for all those things he taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. When you pray, deliver me from evil, part of what you're doing is you're making the evil you face real. We all want to put a good face on our lives. We all want to paint the best possible picture of it. We all don't want to sound like complainers. And yet what Jesus taught us to do is to boldly, courageously, audaciously pray about the evil that we know we face in our lives, day to day, week to week. From situations we're in that we can't get out of. From some of the people in our lives who are seeking to undermine us or hurt us, whatever the case may be. From our past that seems like very heavy baggage that we drag behind us. Deliver us from evil. And the minute you bang on God's door about that, what are you doing? You're making it real. You're not allowing yourself to hide from it anymore. You're not allowing yourself to brush it under the rug. You're making it real. When you ask God for forgiveness, you're making your mistakes real. That's why Christians have the habit of confession. When you ask God to help you forgive other people who hurt you, you're making it real. You're making how they hurt you real, and you're making your resistance to forgiving them real. And we don't come to that conclusion on our own. Human beings, by their very nature, are avoiders. If it makes us uncomfortable, if it's painful in any way, we'd rather not deal with it. Thanks. We will drink ourselves into a stupor. We'll go run an extra 5 miles to avoid the discomfort that we feel within. And Jesus says, stop. You ask, you search, you knock, and you do it because it makes these things that I taught you to pray real. But not only does it do that, it makes you realize how few of those things that he taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer you can do on your own. Let me suggest to you that one of the things that characterizes your prayer life and my prayer life is we pray about things that we think are possible. We do not pray about things that we think are impossible. We pray about the things that make sense to us or that we think God can do in our mind. We don't pray about the things that tend to be outside of what we think is possible or rational or logical. And the reason we do that is human beings don't like to feel how small they are. You don't like to feel how finite you are, and neither do I. You don't like to feel how dependent you are, and neither do I. If you believe the biblical story about human nature, the great original sin of the human race, in part, was that we wanted to feel like we were our own God. And we could handle things on our own and manage the world and our life perfectly well without God in it. There was no need for Him to be the one on whom we all leaned. In a way of saying it, we all decided we'd prefer to live independently, not dependently. And when you take the posture in your prayer life of being someone who asks courageously, who seeks courageously, and who knocks courageously, you are forced to realize about yourself, there's a ton in my life I cannot do on my own. I can't make this happen. I can't find a creative solution on my own. I can't learn enough or read enough or do enough Google searches to find what I need to know to fix it on my own. No. Let me suggest to you that every one of those things that Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer work that way. You and I are dependent upon Him to help us or to give to us or to grace us with the ability to do all of those things. You cannot arrive at that place on your own. Do you have the capacity to give yourself your own daily bread? Now you might think, well, I go to my job, I show up on time, I work. Great. What's preventing you from being downsized tomorrow? Do you think you're going to be the A-plus employee that gets to avoid that? I bet you there are people in the room who raise your hand and tell you, you know what, they were the A-plus employee and it still happened to them. Really? You think you can work hard enough or be valuable enough to the institution that you serve or the organization that employs you that your employment won't go away like that? You haven't lived long enough. You don't know enough people. Can you provide your daily bread on your own? Or do you realize that you are dependent upon God for it? I have an accountability partner in my life with whom I meet once a month. And this person has the daily habit of ending their day with prayers of thanks. And what this person does when they lay down on their bed at night is they walk through their life, wherever their mind goes, and they thank God for all the things in their life that they know in the end God gave them as gifts. So, for instance, one night they thanked God for their warm bed inside a house because they know a lot of the world doesn't live that way. They thanked God for a job that they liked because they know that a lot of the world works jobs they don't like just to provide for their families. And on down the line it goes. You know what my accountability partner is really praying about? Dependence. That this person has the heart to know so much of their life was given to them. They didn't make it work on their own. Everything else in the Lord's Prayer works that way. If you think you're going to have the capacity to forgive other people the way that Jesus says we ought to, you're not. Not without God's help, the ultimate forgiver and grace giver. You think you're going to be able to find enough self-control and courage in your life to resist the temptations that you face like all human beings do? The answer is no. Human beings do not have the strength in and of themselves to face down the worst of themselves without God's help. That, by the way, right, if any of you who are familiar with the 12 steps know that the first 3 steps of the 12-step program is basically that. It's admitting that you can't do it on your own. Jesus taught these people who already prayed a lot, you need to ask audaciously. And the reason you ask about the stuff on the screen courageously and shamelessly in the middle of the night, I don't care when, is that you have to realize you're smaller than you think you are. And I'm bigger than you think I am. And that's the way it's supposed to work. And all those things that in the end feel too large for you are actually just right for me. This is actually where I want to end today, though. Let me take you back to how this all started. Jesus goes out and he prays, as was his custom. And his followers say to him, based on what they saw, Jesus, we're people who pray, but man, we want to pray like you. Because the way you pray is so different from how we do. What's that tell you? Let me tell you something about the Jesus that you love, the Jesus that we honor, and the Jesus that we follow. Let me tell you how he prayed. He prayed the way he taught us to pray. Which means that if you and I had been able to be a fly on a rock out there in the northern Israel valley where he went to pray this day in Luke 11, let me tell you how you would have heard him pray. You would have heard him banging on God's door at midnight. You would have heard him whispering in the window. You would have heard him being audacious and shameless and bold and praying big things to God. He didn't just tell his followers to do it. This is how he prayed, and it's what he passed on to other people. What do you think Jesus was praying about? I'll bet you he was praying about God's will be done. and his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. I'll bet he was praying about raising up a group of people who would ask for much forgiveness and give even more. I'll bet he was praying for people who would have the courage to lean on God to withstand their own temptation and be delivered from the evil all around them. See, we often think that you and I, sitting here 20 centuries later, and all the Christians gathered together today across the globe, we think, well, this is here because Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus was God's unique worker and voice in the world. That Jesus died for our sin. That Jesus rose from the dead. All of those things are true. Let me explain to you part of why you're here and why I'm here. Because Jesus banged on God's door at midnight. And he prayed every day of his earthly life, Father, through me, create a people in whom your kingdom will come. He prayed every day of his life courageously that God would do what had not yet happened. That all different kinds of people, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, free and slave, would be gathered together in a unique, unprecedented way. All because of him and what he did. The reason you and I are here today, the reason the church exists, is because Jesus prayed. And God said yes. Jesus prayed the way that he taught us to pray. And that's why you and I are here. I'm going to give you a chance in a minute to put into practice what Jesus taught us in this little story today about asking, seeking, and knocking. But to finish, I want to give you a couple of quotes from a great book about prayer that's recent called The Circle Maker. Actually, I know one of our small groups is reading through this book. And it does a great job of talking about this particular point that Jesus was trying to make that day in Luke 11. Mark Basterson, the writer of that book, says, quote, "Bold prayers honor God, and God honors bold prayers. God isn't offended by your biggest dreams or boldest prayers. He is offended by anything less. If your prayers aren't impossible to you, they are insulting to God." And then in another place he says very accurately, quote, "Prayers are prophecies. They are the best predictor of your spiritual future. Who you become is determined by how you pray. Ultimately, the transcript of your prayer life becomes the transcript of your actual life." That's what Jesus was trying to say in Luke chapter 11. Today, there are a couple of things you can take home with you that will help you do this during the week. There are some half sheets, they're purple, on your chairs or at your tables. I would encourage you to take those and to live this out during the week. Also, the Branch Church has graciously given us these weekly devotionals that they have written for this series. And the one this week is actually back there on the table at the back of the worship area. Grab a copy of that. It's called Lent Week 1 if you want to figure out which one it is. And that will help you personalize this even more. To end today, I just want you to pause in the quiet. And I want you to do what Jesus said we ought to do. I want you to ask, and I want you to seek, and I want you to knock. I want you to be bold with God. I want you to be audacious with God. But I want you to do it about the things you don't usually pray about. I don't just want you to do it about needs, about daily bread, because I think that's already part of your prayer custom. I want you to do it about other stuff, whatever that other stuff is. You can think of the Lord's Prayer if you want to and pray about some of those other phrases that don't have to do with daily bread. Why don't you do that for a minute, and then we'll be done.